I never dreamed when I got on that plane that how much life could change. This show changes people's lives. All you have to do is just have the guts to go up there and walk across that stage. Trust me, it's a
There are moments in television history that transcend entertainment. Moments where the cameras capture something so raw, so unexpectedly human, that audiences around the world find themselves sitting silently in front of their screens, unable to look away. The moment Simon Cowell, the man who built his entire brand on being unmovable, on being the judge who never flinches, the critic who never softens, broke down in tears over what happened to Richard Goodall, was one of those moments. It stopped people mid-scroll. It made viewers rewind their recordings. It spread across social media not because it was dramatic, but because it felt deeply, uncomfortably real. To understand why that moment hit so hard, you have to understand both men. You have to understand where they came from, what they had lost, and what it really costs to stand in a spotlight that the whole world is pointing at you. This is not simply a story about a talent show. This is a story about grief that gets buried beneath routine, about dreams deferred for so long they begin to feel like someone else's property, and about the unexpected ways that two very different people can recognize the same wound in each other. Richard Goodall was not supposed to be famous. That is not an insult. It is simply the truth of how he lived his life for more than 5 decades. He worked as a custodian at Cheney Monge Middle School in Crest Hill, Illinois, showing up every single day to do a job that most people walk past without acknowledging. He swept floors. He cleaned up after others. He maintained a building full of young people who were, in many ways, just beginning to figure out who they were, while Richard had long since made peace with who he believed himself to be, a quiet man, a hard-working man, a man who sang only when no one was listening. Music had not always been a private thing for Richard. In his younger years, he carried genuine hope that his voice might take him somewhere beyond the ordinary rhythms of working-class life in the Midwest. He auditioned for NBC's The Voice, believing, or at least hoping, that he might finally get a chance to be heard on a larger stage. That chance did not come. He was turned away, and the rejection settled into him the way rejections sometimes do when you have already spent years questioning whether you were ever really meant for something more. He did not become bitter. He became quiet. He returned to the school, to the hallways, to the steady and unglamorous work of showing up. What Richard carried underneath that quietness, however, was something that never fully went away. He had lost his first wife to cancer. That kind of grief does not announce itself loudly. It does not ask for attention or sympathy. It simply takes up residence inside a person and rearranges the furniture of their inner life in ways that are invisible to everyone else. Richard smiled. Richard worked. Richard occasionally sang to himself in empty corridors. And he kept the depth of what he was carrying hidden beneath a demeanor so calm that most people around him had no idea how heavy the weight actually was. Sometimes the universe does not wait for you to be ready. A short video of Richard singing at a school event found its way onto the internet and began to travel. There was nothing polished about it. There was no professional lighting, no backing track carefully calibrated to make a voice sound its best. There was just Richard, standing in the way that working people stand when they are doing something they love without self-consciousness, grounded, unhurried, completely present. And his voice came out of that video like something that had been waiting a very long time to be let out into the open air. People who heard it did not describe it using the language of technical vocal assessment. They did not talk about his range or his breath control or his pitch accuracy, at least not first. What they talked about was how it made them feel. They said it sounded true. They said it sounded like a real human being singing from a real human life, not from a recording studio designed to manufacture emotion on demand. The video spread because it touched something in people that is increasingly rare to encounter in an age of carefully constructed content. Genuine, unperformed feeling. The clip eventually reached the producers of America's Got Talent, and from there it reached Simon Cowell. Simon has spent decades listening to thousands of voices. He has heard singers who have trained for their entire lives, singers who have sacrificed everything to perfect their craft, singers with technical abilities so refined they can do things with their voices that seem almost superhuman. And he has told most of them, in his characteristically direct fashion, that what they have is not quite enough. So when Richard Goodall's video made Simon pause, when it made the most famously unmoved man in the music industry stop and pay genuine attention, that meant something. Richard Goodall walked onto the America's Got Talent stage carrying everything he had always carried. The grief, the years, the quiet certainty that this kind of moment was probably not meant for someone like him. He was visibly nervous. The cameras captured that too, the slight stiffness in his posture, the way his eyes moved across the enormous audience, the brief moment before the music started when he seemed to be having a private conversation with himself about whether he could actually do this. And then he sang. The room changed. There is really no other way to describe it. The thousands of people in that theater, who had arrived expecting to be entertained, found themselves experiencing something that felt more like a privilege than a performance. Simon Cowell, seated at the judge's table with his usual composed authority, listened in a way that those who study him carefully recognized as different from his normal listening. Something in his expression shifted. The professional assessment that usually sits on his face like a mask gave way, briefly but unmistakably, to something more personal. Richard moved through the competition in a way that defied the usual trajectory of reality television contestants. He did not turn up the theatrics as the weeks progressed. He did not reinvent himself or start wearing different clothes or adopt a more telegenic personality. He simply continued to be exactly who he was. A man who had spent a lifetime learning how to feel things deeply and who had, against all his own expectations, found himself in a situation where millions of people were finally able to witness that depth. When he performed alongside members of the legendary rock band Journey, a band whose music had accompanied him through some of the hardest chapters of his own story, the moment was almost too large to process in real time. For Richard, this was not a television stunt or a ratings-driven production choice. Those songs had been with him during his grief. They had played in the background of moments when he did not know how to move forward. Standing on a stage and singing them with the people who created them was the kind of thing that cannot be fully communicated in a broadcast, but that everyone watching somehow understood anyway. Simon Cowell is not a man who cries easily. His entire public identity has been constructed around the opposite quality: the ability to remain unmoved while delivering honest assessments that others might soften or avoid. His tears, when they come, are not performance. They are not calculated for audience impact or crafted to make good television. When Simon cries, it is because something has genuinely gotten through the considerable armor he has spent decades building around himself. What happened to Richard Goodall after the competition, the full weight of what became clear about what Richard had been carrying, the grief over his late wife, the decades of invisible endurance, the way he had kept his most meaningful self hidden away in the corridors of a school where no one thought to look, reached Simon in a way that went past the professional and became personal. Simon spoke about it with a directness that surprised many people who had only ever seen his sharp on-screen persona. He confirmed that Richard was carrying a serious emotional burden. And as he spoke about it, the composure broke. Those who witnessed or learned about that moment later described it as one of the most genuinely human things they had ever seen from a figure who had, for years, seemed to exist on a plane slightly above ordinary human vulnerability. Simon did not cry because Richard had a sad backstory that made for compelling television content. He cried because he recognized something. He cried because he has lost people too. He has faced the particular silence that follows a loss so deep that you stop knowing how to talk about it. He has understood, in his own way, what it means to keep moving forward when part of you has stopped. Simon Cowell's life has never been the uncomplicated success story that his public image suggests. He was born into a household that measured worth through achievement and offered little unconditional warmth. His father worked in the music industry and communicated love primarily through the language of professional success. His mother, a former ballet dancer, maintained an emotional distance that left young Simon feeling perpetually unseen. He grew up learning that the way to earn recognition was to accomplish things, not to express feelings, and certainly not to show weakness. His early professional life was marked by failure that he rarely discusses in depth. A record label he founded with genuine ambition collapsed under the pressure of a changing market, leaving him with debt and the particular humiliation of having to return to his parents' home as an adult man who had tried and failed in public. That experience, of believing in yourself, of stepping forward, of having the ground give way beneath you, is something that never entirely leaves a person, no matter how much success comes afterward. What came afterward, for Simon, was enormous. He rebuilt himself with a tenacity that is easy to miss when you are watching his television performances, because on screen it looks effortless and even slightly cruel. But the sharpness of his assessments, the refusal to soften uncomfortable truths, comes from a man who has lived the cost of self-deception and found it too high. He knows what it looks like when someone is performing confidence they do not actually have. He knows what it sounds like when a voice is technically capable but emotionally hollow. And he knows, because he has felt it himself, what genuine feeling sounds like when it finally gets out into the open. When Simon looked at Richard Goodall, at this man who had spent decades keeping his most precious self locked away in private moments, who had continued to show up and do the work even when the dream seemed permanently out of reach, who had carried grief and kept going, he was not just seeing a talented contestant. He was seeing something that resonated with his own private knowledge of what endurance actually costs. In September of 2024, Richard Goodall was announced as the winner of America's Got Talent Season 19. The audience responded with the kind of emotion that is not manufactured by production teams or encouraged by crowd warm-up staff. It was the genuine release of weeks of accumulated feeling, the sensation of watching someone finally receive something they deserved, long past the moment when most people would have stopped expecting it. The prize that comes with winning America's Got Talent is marketed as $1 million, and on a surface level that sounds transformative. The reality is considerably more complicated. The money is not delivered in a single payment. It is structured as an annuity paid out over 40 years, which means the actual annual sum before taxes is $25,000. Meaningful, but not the life-altering windfall the headline number implies. Winners who choose a lump sum instead typically receive somewhere between $300,000 and $400,000 after taxes. Beyond the financial structure, winning comes with contractual obligations that give the show's producers significant influence over the winner's career choices, appearances, and recordings. For someone like Richard, who was only beginning to understand what his new public life might look like, these structures presented a complexity that the celebration of the victory night did not immediately reveal. But Richard had also found something on that stage that cannot be quantified in prize money or contract clauses. Just before the final results were announced, he had married his longtime partner Angie Vanovan in Pasadena, California. The timing was both intensely pressured and deeply stabilizing. Angie had been present throughout the competition in ways that went beyond mere encouragement. She had pushed Richard toward parts of himself that he had been avoiding, including the search for his biological father, a man he had never known, who turned out to be a retired K-9 police officer and Army veteran. That reunion, and the discovery of siblings Richard had never known he had, reshaped his understanding of his own origins in ways that the public would never fully see, but that mattered enormously to him personally. After the applause and the confetti and the media coverage that followed his win, Richard Goodall made a decision that surprised a great many people. He went home. He went back to the school. He walked through the same hallways where he had spent more than 2 decades, greeted the same students and colleagues, and continued to do the same work that had shaped him into the person capable of winning a national competition in the first place. This was not a publicity move or a calculated display of humility designed to maintain his relatability with the public. It was a genuine expression of who Richard is and what he values. The school was not a symbol of limitation to him. It was the place where he had remained himself through all the years when remaining himself was all he had. The routines of that work had given him stability when his grief threatened to make the floor feel unstable beneath his feet. The students in those hallways had received the same version of him year after year. Reliable, present, unpretentious. He was not willing to simply walk away from that. He did eventually sign a record deal, and his debut album, Believe Again, gave the world a document of what his voice sounds like when given a proper platform. He performed at the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville and received a standing ovation. He sang the national anthem at an Indiana Pacers game. He opened for Howie Mandel at a live show. Each of these experiences expanded his world incrementally, and he moved through them with the same unhurried groundedness he had always carried. He also established the Believe in Fund at his school, a financial resource for students who have musical aspirations but lack the means to pursue them, ensuring that the opportunities he had been denied in his own youth might be available to the next generation coming up in his community. The city of Terre Haute honored him with a key to the city. The school held a celebration, and Richard continued to show up, to greet people by name, to be the person he had always been, now simply with a larger audience aware of his existence. It is tempting to read Richard Goodall's story as a simple narrative about dreams coming true, and it is not wrong to see it that way. But there is something more complex and more valuable underneath that surface reading. Richard did not win because he spent decades perfectly preparing for his moment. He was not strategically building toward a television competition that he always knew was coming. He was simply living, imperfectly, with grief, with quiet perseverance, with a voice he shared with almost no one, and that life, in all its unheroic ordinariness, turned out to be the thing that made his eventual success feel true. Simon Cowell, for all his power and wealth and professional certainty, recognized something in that ordinariness that his own life had taught him to recognize. The particular dignity of someone who keeps going not because they are certain it will lead somewhere but because stopping would mean abandoning the last remaining piece of themselves that still hopes. Simon has rebuilt himself from failure. He has navigated public scandal and private loss. He has suffered serious physical injury and spent long months in recovery. And he has done all of it while maintaining a persona that asks the world not to look too closely at the man behind the sharp remarks. When Richard Goodall's story finally broke through that persona, when the weight of what this quiet man had been carrying became clear, the response was not manufactured sympathy. It was recognition. It was one person who knows what endurance costs looking at another person who has paid that cost for a very long time, and feeling the weight of it without being able to maintain the professional distance that normally keeps such feelings at arm's length. Stories like Richard Goodall's tend to endure not because they are exceptional in the way that word is usually understood, not because of record-breaking vocal ranges or unprecedented competition results, but because they are representative. They stand in for the uncounted lives of people who have tucked their most meaningful selves away in quiet places, who have continued to do the work even when the work felt invisible, who have carried losses that never fully healed while maintaining the outward appearance of someone simply getting on with things. Most of those people will never stand on a stage and sing in front of millions. Most of them will never have a Simon Cowell recognize the weight they are carrying and respond to it with tears. But they will see themselves in Richard, and that recognition is worth something that prize money cannot adequately measure. Richard Goodall won a competition, and that is a fact. But what he gave to the people who watched him was something closer to permission. Permission to believe that the dreams you stop chasing are not necessarily dead, that the voice you only use when no one is listening might still have somewhere important to go, and that the most ordinary seeming life can contain depths that the world has simply not yet had the chance to discover. Simon Cowell's tears were not about a janitor who could sing. They were about what it means to finally be seen, and about the complicated, costly, sometimes beautiful truth that being seen, when it finally happens, does not erase the years of invisibility but somehow makes them meaningful in retrospect. That is the story